Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Scrum Down NBC Sports Rugby Podcast. I am your host with the most, Alex Lowe, and it is great to be back, everyone. Long episode, so not going to spend too much time on the intro, but we have a really good show for you today. We're going to start the show with Alex Lowe coming back on the pod. We're going to continue with some of the developments from the London Irish story that we touched on last week, and also have a little update of Worcester and Wasps and what's going on and some of the news in the week around there. Then we're going to park that and look towards our Premiership semi-final matchups, which, if you are in America, are both live on CNBC across the weekend, as well as Peacock TV, which all Premiership rugby is available live and on demand. Myself, Dan Lyle will be in studio, and for myself to preview these weekends, I brought on performance analyst Ross Hamilton back to the pod. He's been running all the numbers for ourselves at NBC Sports, but also at BT Sport. He's got some really good insight and numbers behind the matchup, which I think tells a great story. So I love getting him on and getting that insight to you as well. Thanks to everyone that supported the episode last week. It wasn't an easy topic to discuss with London Irish, a club very close to my heart, but I also feel that had to do it justice to make sure that this story was talked about, and also that the players were finally paid last week, which will react in the interview with Alex Lowe. But I do think that was a big factor, and you know, glad to see them paid. It actually was what I said on the pod previously, is that I felt the current owner should step up if this situation did continue, and that is what happened. But I don't want to spoil it anymore. Let's get into the chat with Alex Lowe. And we are joined by the returning Alex Lowe, as Alex, sadly, there are still a bit more bad news topics, especially financially, to talk about when it comes to Premiership rugby. We had quite an in-depth detail pod last week chatting about London Irish and all the issues they had as the players had at the time had not been paid. Obviously, there's been some developments since. I think we'll leave last week's with the main crux of the episode details sort of as a standalone, so we won't sort of rehash too much now. We'll just pick up from where we left off, and anyone who is not in the know or aware of the story, I do advise you to go back and listen to last week's to catch up and get up to speed. But Alex, welcome back. What's the latest with London Irish?
Thanks, Corbs. I think you're going to have to sign me up for some of the big pods, like after the Prem final and through the World Cup, so that your listeners don't see my name and think, oh no, more bad news in the Prem. We've got, so actually it's good news to a degree. Since we last spoke, the London Irish players and staff have all been paid, but it's not purely good news. It went right to the wire. I mean, literally minutes before the players were due to hand in legal letters to the club, claiming breach of contract because their salaries hadn't been paid for a week. We're talking, they were ready, I think in the car park, ready to walk in and hand the letters in at 4:45, and at about 4:42 p.m. They received confirmation that the current owners, or the company that the current owner is also chairman of, Powerday, were going to pay all the outstanding wages. There's been a bit of consternation over here as to, you know, where Mick Crossan, the owner, had been for that week, why the players and the staff were being given assurances that the money was coming and then it never came. So there are some questions to be answered there if anyone at London Irish was ever minded to actually engage with anyone. They at the moment remain unanswered, and therefore there is this level of uncertainty. So everyone's been paid for last month, but we're now 9-10 days into May. This issue is going to start cropping up again towards the end of May, unless this takeover can be completed. And what we understand about the takeover is it's been delayed because we believe there are 6 interested parties forming this consortium from the United States. They have not declared proof of funds to the RFU, and they have not declared to the RFU which of those parties would be the principal owner, whose name would be above the door, effectively, of London Irish. And though that information is critical to this takeover progressing, and as I understand it, that has not been provided. And so we're in this state of limbo still with London Irish and its future.
Got a few questions. So, first thing is with regards to this group, and this far down the line. And one of the things we talked on a little bit last week was that, players were told internally October, November time that there was funding secured. We are now in May, and we still can't even produce the names of any of the people behind the secured funding, or let alone any details of who, what, where, or proof of funds. Is that alarming? Like, is that a red flag, or is there reasonable solutions that could be behind this? And I'm just getting a bit nervous because I'm worried about London Irish, or what?
We have to consider it to be a red flag until we're given any reason to believe otherwise. And I might have touched on this last week, but this season we've seen Worcester Warriors and Wasps go to the wall, particularly Worcester. There were promises that a takeover was just about to happen, promises that money was just about to arrive, investment had been secured, and it never happened. There were empty words and empty promises to the players, to the staff, and to the fans. We've all lived through that. Now, this situation is different, but for me, until the prospective owners are prepared to actually put some meat on the bone, they're prepared to step up, tell us who they are, and tell us what their intentions are with London Irish, because there are questions. Why would anyone want to buy a club that's 30 million pounds in debt and doesn't own its own stadium? These are fundamental questions, and we don't know what the vision is. We don't know who they are, and they're going to great lengths to protect their identity, which for me has to be a concern. I want to believe that this is all going to pan out the way, in a positive way. And the players have been told that some of these investors have links with big franchises, much bigger than London Irish. My assumption, therefore, is US sports franchises. We know that. I'll tell you what we do know. We know that the whole thing is being fronted by a man called Howard Thomas, who used to be the chief executive of Premiership Rugby. He works for a sports marketing agency in the UK who have links with an investment fund called 777. Now, 777 are not buying the club, but all our information is that they are involved in this takeover in some way. Now, they own European football teams, soccer teams. They own the London basketball team in the British Basketball League. They have sporting connections, but we don't know anymore. And I find that alarming. And I do know that there have been representations made to the club and the owners, the prospective owners, to just come out and give a bit. What we've had are sort of positive words. Everything's going to be fine, but there's no meat behind it. I really think, for the sake of the club supporters and the people who work there, more to the point, they deserve a bit more information about where this is supposed to be heading.
And that's sort of my next question is last week players were told the money's in transit. There was bank holidays. There was talk of potentially multiple banks that the transfer has to go through. I'm just going to be honest. I've sent money across Atlantic in quite large sums for certain things. It does take a couple days, but we're now I'm just saying, I have some experience. I had to buy a house here, all this stuff. It does take 3, sometimes 4 days, but it never takes this long. And the players who, I believe, from what I've heard, were asking, exit day at the club today, leaving last end up meetings. The first thing I heard was that they were asking for updates on the money, what was going on, and the CEO couldn't provide any more clarity or updates on what was going on with that. And then the other aspect that I think that I've heard is that this group was supposed to come by the end of the season, introduce themselves, announce to the boys before everyone left. That hasn't happened as well. It just starts to seem like, not all lining up to how you would want it to go when you're hoping this thing's going to go well, is probably the most polite way to say it.
That lack of information, or that misinformation, is critical here, Alex. Like you say, it might take, as you've been moving your millions across the Atlantic,
millions.
When you have begun the transaction in one country, you'll have documentary evidence that money's on its way. You'll have the bank will give you a receipt. And we'd got to the point at London Irish where the players were asking for proof of this transfer. They were asking to be shown documentary evidence. They were asking to see the receipt, and the club couldn't provide it. And one of the things we saw with Worcester, and we started to see last week with London Irish, was the breakdown in trust between the staff and the players on one side and those executives running the club. Because if you keep saying the money's coming, but I've got no receipt, I can't give you any evidence of it, people stop believing you. And that's exactly what happened with Worcester. And you saw it on Thursday and Friday of last week. The players wanted to play. The players were tight. The players are professionals. They're committed to each other. They're committed to the club and the team. They wanted to play. They asked whether they could receive guarantees that they were insured to play. They had medical insurance to play in the last game of the season. They were told that they did, but they went back to the club and said, we need to see this in writing. Now, for me, if your employees no longer trust what you're telling them, then that is a major red flag that this is being handled really badly, and that the people who you're supposed to be looking after as employees, employer-employee relationship, if that is breaking down to the point where you're being asked for documentary evidence to support your word, then I think you've got a real problem.
That's what's quite crazy, is like the money hasn't come in. So obviously, most likely wasn't sent. If you're going to just be looking at, it said it was sent, it's taken this long, they still don't know where it is. There's no evidence. So I think the most reasonable assumption is to say that it probably wasn't sent. And I do feel a lot of sympathy for some of the staff at London Irish, and especially the CEO and people, because I don't know if it's genuinely true, but I've just heard that they're not involved in any of these discussions or negotiations. So what I'm hearing, it's predominantly Mick and Power Day and that element that is dealing with whatever's being discussed with the US. And that's why there's so little details or ability from, I think, the staff to give true insight into what's going on, because I think, honestly, they are potentially in the dark as well. The other thing that's starting to get me a little bit worried with this is, as we said, tracking on, still don't know the name, still not given, is that I'm now hearing as well that other clubs are starting to circle agents on London Irish players. And in the last day or two, apparently quite a lot of that have come from the other teams, which starts to make you alarmed that maybe there is something to worry about and they have a sniff of it before it becomes in the public. I don't know, but have you heard anything like that?
I know for sure that there are agents who are concerned enough about the future of the club that they are finding contingency or provisional deals for their players elsewhere. I spoke to one agent who's got a handful of players at London Irish. He said he'd already found options for 3 of them for next season, should the worst happen. We're also hearing that there are players who London, I think we mentioned this last week, players who London Irish want to sign, really promising England under-20 players who are choosing to go elsewhere because of the uncertainty. So this is already having a material impact on the club, not just for the end of the season just gone, but in future years. So this lack of trust is only going to breed uncertainty, and it's no surprise to hear that other Premiership clubs are circling. They began circling when Worcester were in trouble. They began circling when Wasps were in trouble. And London Irish, until we hear any solid evidence to the contrary, have to be seen to be in trouble. And you're right, if there are other Premiership rivals, and London Irish have got some quality players there who any club would want to sign. It's no surprise to me to hear that that inquiries are being made and that agents are looking at alternatives, because what else should they do?
It really is a heartbreaking situation for me, because this is a club that, have come full circle, really sort of moved their way up into that second half of the table, much more competitive, rebuilt their academy, have, a nice stadium in West London, all these different things that you could go. But then you're looking at the outside in, like, why is this deal not happening? There has to be some sort of standstill or some sort of stumbling block on the negotiations between the current owner and the new ownership. Otherwise, you feel like the wires or the bridge would have been crossed. And then the next thing you got to look at is when the players weren't paid, it came down to the wire of them about to breach their contracts till, my understanding, the existing ownership through Power Day paid their wages. And I believe it was minutes before the deadline. And I believe within 20 minutes or so, the money was in the account. So they obviously must have had the money ready to go. They must have had some knowledge that it wasn't coming from America or there's something going on. They maybe is a negotiating ploy, a standstill, but I don't know, like that's my point, but there's got to be something else going on behind the scenes that is halting this at the moment, because it seems silly to let it go any further. Even if you were a new ownership, you don't want to tarnish your brand or the business or risk players leaving or not being able to recruit by leaving this in such an awkward position that it is at the moment, or vulnerable position.
Yeah, the Power Day role is really interesting here because obviously Mick Crossan, who owns London Irish, he started Power Day, this firm, 40 odd years ago. And I was sent during last week. Someone sent me a link to the Power Day strategic report from 2001, 2002, in which they have committed in a public document that London Irish will always be supported by Power Day. And the reason that I was sent that was to highlight the fact that although it had been the US consortium that had paid the wages the month before, it was not their responsibility to pay the wages of the employees of London Irish. It's the owners of London Irish who hold that responsibility, and Power Day had committed in a public document to do that. So when they stepped in after a week, people might say it was only a week, but this was a monthly paycheck. People have mortgages that come out on the first of a month that couldn't be paid. I mean, this is not how a company that's committed to supporting a club and therefore hundreds of people. That's not how they should be operating, in my view. So you would think that you would think, and like you, we're just surmising here. We're just trying to join the dots a little bit. Was this a standoff? Was this trying to force the hand of the Americans? Because for a long time it was the American consortium that was taking all the heat here for not supplying the money, and it was only latterly that the narrative began to be, well, it's not actually their responsibility. It's London Irish's responsibility, and then the money got paid.
Who said that? Who said that?
You
that
said
was
that.
basically my big point last week. It just seems crazy now, as the club are actually desperate and on their knees. Mick is not seeming to be in a position to put any more capital in, just to even pay wages of the staff while he's still owning the team. To me, is mind-blowing that he's not getting more heat, and it's all been directed at this group and what's going on when you've got a current owner who is the one responsible for this at the time.
I came off our conversation last week thinking that's absolutely the case. And the narrative began to shift a little bit because of it, because of the questions that were being asked. There must be something going on in the background, because I'm no businessman, but a year ago, Mick Crossan said that he would give London Irish away for £1, which doesn't leave him an awful lot of negotiating room. Now, clearly things are way more complicated. The way that the club's training ground, the ownership and the funding model there is complicated. Things are complicated, but like you said, there was a commitment made in October. We're now in May. This needs to be sorted, because for the good of the people who work there, they've got a summer now where they're not sure what their employment status is, what the future's going to hold, and that's not good enough. That's not good enough.
I agree, mate. I think that's a good place to leave it. Like TBT, how it develops, and fingers crossed that we get some positive news in this topic, because if anyone knows, I love covering positive news about London Irish, but I also feel this is essential news that needs covering and needs to be talked about. There's a lot of loyal fans that want to know what's going on. I've been surprised it hasn't been getting enough media coverage across the board, and maybe that's because people are worried of sounding alarm bells and making it more vulnerable. I'm not sure, but I do feel like this is something that needs to be discussed and needs as much transparency as possible from the players, the staff, the supporters, to sort of the league and rugby fan base in general. Like, really, I feel like it'd be silly not to talk about this when something so major, positively or negatively, could be going on here.
Yeah, you're right, and we're all on the same boat here. I mean, we all are connected to sport in our different ways because we love it, because it's our hobby that we used to play. It's our passion. It's what gives us our escape from the real world. So we're always conscious of balancing the bad news and the necessary news, like you say, with what it is about our sport that people love. And there is so much good about London Irish. So just look at they've got the players they've got. Even they're losing a couple, but next season, all being well, they'll have Tom Pearson, Henry Arundel, Will Joseph, Ben Loader, all these they got just a crop of really exciting players.
Just good homegrown talent throughout the whole squad again, which is what London Irish used to always have. And
Absolutely.
It's finally restored it to where it deserves to be in the Premiership.
Homegrown and playing really good rugby, and high quality, high entertainment rugby. And they finished 5th in the league, 3 points off the semi-finals. There's so much good about Irish, and there's been so much good about this season. The narratives, the storylines that we've seen, the rugby we've seen on the field, and we have to keep reminding ourselves that we don't just want to be doom and gloom merchants. It's like I joked at the start, there is so much to enjoy, and we've got 2 Premiership semi-finals coming up that you're talking about on the pod. We've got European finals, Prem final at Twickenham. There's so much good in the game, but we have to also acknowledge the difficulties, and connected to London Irish, we've got sort of developments with Worcester and Wasps this week, where we've seen.
You read my mind. I was about to say, let's go a bit more doom and gloom and continue that vibe. And while we're on this segment,
I'll be quick. So let's start with Wasps. Wasps they've committed to fulfilling all these various criteria that the RFU laid down in order to take their place in the Championship next season, the second tier. But that was conditional upon them fulfilling a whole load of other criteria. Now, the deadline is looming. By the next RFU board meeting, which is later this month, they need to have proven a whole load of things that basically proven that they are going to be ready to play in the Championship. And that means providing evidence that they are close to appointing a director of rugby, if not having already appointed one, that they've got a proper plan to recruit a squad. And then there's loads of other governance matters that need to be addressed. But if you just think about it now, we're in May, there's no director of rugby, and there are no players signed to Wasps. And by the end of this month, so within 2 to 3 weeks, they need to provide the RFU with evidence of how they're going to recruit a competitive squad and who the director of rugby is going to be to lead it. The clock is ticking on Wasps and their participation in the Championship next season. And if they cannot convince the RFU that they're going to be a viable club in the Championship, then they won't play in the league pyramid next season, which would be devastating. So obviously we hope that they can get things together to meet all those demands from the RFU. But to me, it would feel like a tall order. They don't have anyone, they can't recruit any players because they have no director of rugby. And I'm hearing that agents are emailing board members and not getting a reply. Like, they're asking what the recruitment strategy is and they're not getting a reply. So more red flags there. The Wasps and Worcester situations are connected because one of the criteria that they have to fulfill is where they're going to play. Now, Wasps have already been signed off to play at a football stadium, a very small football stadium near Birmingham.
Solihull
Moors FC. They have asked if they can go and play at Six Ways, where Worcester Warriors used to play. And the owner of Wasps, through another company that he owns, has loaned Worcester Warriors £1.15 million. Now, Wasps say that this was just effectively to secure like a deposit on the lease for 3 years. But it's not gone down very well at all with the Worcester Warriors Supporters Trust, who have written to the RFU and accused and argued that the entire deal, A, the idea of Wasps playing in Worcester, and B, the loan that has gone from Wasps to Worcester, it breaches multiple RFU regulations, and therefore the whole thing should be blocked. The Worcester fans are up in arms because while Wasps would bring professional rugby to Worcester, they're not Wasps fans. They're Worcester Warriors fans, and they argue that the owners of Worcester Warriors should be bringing professional rugby, men's rugby, back to Worcester, but those owners aren't interested because they don't want to comply with the RFU regulations. So everything here is interconnected, and we go around in circles. But there's a lot. Wasps. Let's focus on Wasps. They have a lot to prove in the next couple of weeks if they're going to take their place in the championship, and if they don't, then the future is very bleak for them.
It doesn't sound great. Just one follow-up question on the Worcester side of the loan. So Alex Lowe got this money from the former chairman of Wasps, but there's something about they have to pay it back by a certain amount of days, and if not, like, I saw an article headline, but I don't know quite the details. So I'm just asking from the outside if you could explain a bit more, because there's a bit more to it, as I understand.
Yeah, so it has been claimed that the Worcester owners borrowed this money from Loxwood Holdings, which is the company, because they needed it to finalise the takeover of the club, and that the loan is due to be repaid within 3 weeks. And the claim is that if Worcester cannot repay that money within 3 weeks, then Six Ways will have to be sold, and therefore Wasps wouldn't be able to play there anyway. So one of the points that's been made to the RFU is that no one party should have an interest, directly or indirectly controlling interest in two clubs, and they claim that that's what has happened here, because if that loan has been used to secure the purchase by the Worcester owners, then the argument is that the RFU should be looking into whether that breaks the rules. It's really super complicated, but I think the concern is that that the Worcester owners have used loaned money from Wasps in order to complete the takeover, which raises more red flags about whether they actually have the funds to complete the takeover themselves.
That's the question mark. And my last question is it too far for administrators to change their minds now? Is it completely gone? So this is definitely going to happen. Whatever happens, Worcester, like, the ground would get sold. There's no recourse, or only because I looked at Twitter comments to some of the news articles, and that's what people are writing. So that's the only reason why I thought I'd ask, just to wonder what is actually the reality of if all this happens.
My understanding is that the deal for Atlas to buy Worcester has been completed, and it's been signed off by the administrator. If they've borrowed money to finalise the deal and then can't pay it back, then suddenly the whole thing starts again, and maybe the stadium has to go into administration and be sold in order to pay back that loan. I mean, the mismanagement that's happened and the abuse of Worcester Warriors is absolutely off the scale over the last year, and how this historic, not enormously successful when compared to a Wasps or a Leicester or a Saracens, but an historic club that's been around for 150 years, heart of the community, represented brilliantly by former owner Cecil Duckworth. That club, it just doesn't exist anymore. There's a stadium there and there's a piece of land. Worcester Warriors doesn't even exist as a club on paper because they don't have a license to play. The mismanagement and abuse of that club is disgraceful.
It's crazy, mate. I guess that sort of sums up our doom and gloom segment of the show. But I'm going to have to just get you on to react to something happy next time. Indeed. But no, Alex, thank you so much for your insight as always. And as anyone listening, if they're unaware, Alex's writing has been on sort of the pulse of or the heartbeat as such of this story, and giving updates on a lot of these areas. So make sure you check out his work at the Times and check him out on Twitter as well. But Alex, thanks again for your time, and I'm sure we'll speak again soon, because there's probably bound to be more bad news.
Thanks for having me on.
Cheers, mate. Always good to have Alex on, and some really good insight there. Sad times for London Irish. Hopefully this is just a little blip and it actually all goes through and we get happy times for London Irish, but there's definitely some worrying signs there that hopefully will become addressed, or at least we'll get more clarity on over these next couple of weeks, as I'm expecting hopefully an update on what is going on with this takeover. But now it is time to transition to the Premiership semi-finals, and to preview those in amazing depth, we have Ross Hamilton back on the pod. Let's get into it. And we are joined by the returning Ross Hamilton, performance analyst, friend of the pod. Ross, welcome back, mate. Premiership semi-final weekend, and some big matchups to talk about.
Yeah, mate, thanks for having me back. A couple of big games, two very different games, probably, you might think, with the teams who are involved and the stars of play between each semi-final. Both really exciting in different ways, and I'm very happy to take you through some of the numbers of that today.
Definitely. Well, let's start by going sort of team by team. So why don't we start with Saracens, top of the table. A lot of people's favourites at the moment have had some injuries and some areas of potential concern with some players missing, but still a formidable force that a lot of people are favouring coming into the semi-final.
Yeah, you've got to think so. It's still the favourites for me as well. Saracens are probably the only team in the semi-finalists for me who have a very strong attack and defence. They're strong on both sides of the ball. We can go into Northampton and Sale and Leicester. They have sort of one area of strength. Saracens, for me, have two, maybe even more. So for me, again, that sets them up really well, especially against Northampton. The first thing I'll mention, actually, sort of for both of these two teams, I had a look at the scoring profile of these teams and when they score their points throughout the 80 minutes of the match. We can break it up sort of per quarter. They both actually start quite slowly. They then are very equal within that middle 40 minutes of the game, but it's the final 20 that sets them apart. So Saracens have the second best points difference in the final 20. Northampton have the worst. So yes, Northampton play really well and they attack and they get some great rugby on show, but the way the game opens up towards the end of the games for them just means that there is so much space for their opposition to do exactly the same back to them. So we might see this. The game could be really close up until 60 minutes, and we think Northampton are in with a chance. Certainly will be. But it's that final quarter that's going to be the biggest challenge for them. It's 110 points difference between Northampton and Saracens just in that last 20 minutes across the season. Obviously, that's over 20 games, and this is just one, but it does add up, and there is going to be a big element to that final 20 that's going to be huge for Northampton.
And if you're going to characterize Saracens sort of by the data, like how would you characterize their style, or what you expect from them out in these knockout rounds?
Something for Saracens, for me, I think they've changed quite dramatically from last year. Their willingness to play rugby, and I'll touch on that a little bit more, has vastly improved for me. Typically, we might associate them to what Leicester are doing this year, and Leicester are obviously heavily influenced by Saracens with Borthwick and Richard Wigglesworth as well. But Saracens have opened up their game a little bit, more willing to play. Now, they've got their defence as well. So, I mean, you could argue they've got the second best defence in the competition this season to Sale. You could argue they've got the second best attack in the competition to Northampton. But in terms of Saracens' attack, their willingness to play from range has gone up. They don't need to kick into the 22 and sort of play from there with a line out. They can score from anywhere. They've scored the second most tries from outside the 22 in the whole competition, Northampton the most. They've scored the third most tries from broken play. So they were happy to take those kick receipts, those turnovers, and play with the ball and go and find that space. A huge, huge difference, a huge shift for me than what we've seen in previous years from them.
It's quite remarkable, you know, that they went away from that style that for so long got them so much success, but they've managed to reinvent themselves and also seem to still be in that lane of success. And that sometimes, you know, is quite hard to do in a quite a short period of time, but they seem to have almost in a season or so made that shift.
Yeah, look, I mean, again, I mentioned the sort of second best attack to Northampton. They've made the second, this is Saracens, have made the second most meters per game, around 440, forgive me. The second most clean breaks, nearly 10 per game. The most defenders beaten, 22 defenders beaten per game. The second most offloads. So you link that kind of attack to a Saracens team that doesn't typically in the past add up. They're very much a kick, defense style team, but they've got the capabilities. As you said, it's pretty amazing that they seem to have flicked a switch in one season and gone to the second best attack in the league whilst maintaining their defence as well. I think that's something important to add.
It's impressive, and they're a team that's always sort of, you know, continued to evolve and very rarely have sort of stood still. So it's quite fitting for them and their model that they have found this new sort of style and reinvented themselves to this level. Is there anything else on Saracens you want to touch on before we close the book on them and look a bit more at Saints?
Well, just on their defence being sort of the other side of that coin and the thing that they can do well from both sides, as I mentioned. And I think their defence matches Northampton's strengths really well. So they have the ability to stop Northampton, whereas perhaps other teams might not. And I'll come on to a bit of Northampton shortly. But Saracens concede the fewest tries from broken play. They concede the fewest tries from what we call multi-phase, anything after one. Now, that becomes important when I talk about Northampton's ruck speed shortly. But then a big one as well for Saracens is they win the most turnovers in the competition this season per game. So Northampton can make the line breaks, they can make meters, they can get over the gain line as much as they want. If that ball is eventually turned over, it counts for nothing. And that could be one turnover and it could account for 90 meters made, a couple of line breaks within the phases. Saracens turn the ball over at the end of the defence and your attack has got you 0 points, which is obviously the ultimate goal. So I think they're really, really well set up to manage everything that Northampton are going to throw at them. I think if we move on to Northampton, Northampton probably aren't that in defence to be able to manage Saracens. So I think that's where Saracens have the advantage. They can do both, and they're going to have a chance to stop Northampton where they're strong.
And when you look at Northampton and their attack, like how would you characterize it by data, style? You know, where do their tries come from? What sort of team are they?
Yeah, they are definitely much I'm going to call them a jouet team. They play rugby. They are happy to play. They're happy to make mistakes off of the back of that. They make the most turnovers conceded per game, the most unforced errors. There's not even forced in a tackle or a turnover or anything like that. But they accept that. They'll accept that risk that they're going to make errors because of the output that they get. I had a look at some of the numbers, and just to give you an idea, they are first in so many attacking categories, and it's crazy to be first in a couple, 2 or 3 or 4 across the entire season, with every team in the league being so strong, and they are first in even more than that. They've scored the most tries from outside the 22. Again, happy to play, very successful at it. The most tries from broken play, typically the best areas to attack when a defence is in transition and a little bit chaotic. As I mentioned, they've scored the most tries on multiple phases. They don't score many on the strike phase. They need multiple phases to break their opposition down, and they do that with the fastest ruck speed. They average 3.5 seconds for their rucks across the entire game. So across 100 plus rucks, that's phenomenally quick. That then gets them onto the front foot. They have the best gain line success of any team in the competition. 46% of their carries are over the gain line, not just on them. Make the most meters, nearly 500 meters per game. The most line breaks at 10 per game. The most red zone entries at about 10 per game as well. So all of those combined is just so much pressure on opposition, and they score the most tries and points off of the back of that. They're the sort of simple ones to put in. But there's so many elements of that where they're the very, very best. For me, they have to be, and they're going to have to be able to beat Saracens when they're not going to be able to stop them as well.
I think it's fascinating because for me, I still think Saints have this outside chance. Like, I still think with some of the gain line players that they have in that team, that if they get their attack right, they're definitely going to be able to score against Saris. That I think the issue for me is do they have the defensive nature to shut them down and to keep them at bay, considering how efficient in the way that over 80 minutes they can just seem to just relentlessly run up points as they finally sort of break the dam by just consistency of putting you under pressure and playing their style.
I mean, Northampton concede on average more tries than anybody in the league this year, but it's more than 4 every single game. So they're going to have to score more than 4 against the Saracens defence in this game in order to win. Are they capable of that? Yes, absolutely. Definitely seen it. Will it come to fruition during a game that's going to be a bit tetchy? It's a semi-final, it's a knockout round. It's hard. Again, that final 20 minutes that I mentioned in the scoring profile might come into play quite a lot towards the end of the game. Definitely have the ability. Whether they're going to be able to do it or not, that's a different question, and we'll see on the weekend.
No, absolutely. Because I just feel as well, even psychologically for me, when one team is so heavily favoured, the other team almost has nothing to lose, comes out, and I think that Saints team at least has players and has shown that they can score enough points to on their day potentially give Sarries a go, because I do think it's quite a big rivalry. When I played, this was a massive rivalry, and it's good to see it sort of reigniting itself and Saints finding themselves nearer that sort of end of the table, especially at the end of the season. If we look ahead to the next semi-final, two teams that have, some similarities, a lot of differences. Sale taking on Leicester. Leicester, obviously, last year's defending champions. Sale finishing above. They'll have the home semi-final with them coming in second and Leicester coming in third. What do you make of this game, maybe starting from the home side, Sale's point of view?
Yeah, very different game. If we're talking about sort of the attacking nature of Saracens and Northampton and how willing they are to play with the ball this year, especially, that's probably not going to be the case with these two. Not to say it's going to be a boring game. It's just going to be different, a little bit more attritional, perhaps. You might see a lot more power involved in this game. Sale, for me, their super strength is their defence. They've conceded the fewest tries and points in the league this season. And again, they are first in their defensive categories by so far and so many, very much like Northampton are in attack. But a couple of big ones that stood out for me. Sale have the most dominant tackles in the competition. Over 10% of their tackles are dominant. And I know that might seem like not very much, but a dominant tackle where you stop your opposition on the gain line and drive them back, that's very rare and that's hard to do. So 1 in 10 is actually really high. And you can see that from some of their tacklers and some of their defense that they put in. They've got huge players to do that job. They concede the gain line the fewest times to their opposition, so they don't let their opposition get beyond them. They can manage that defensive line very well. They then slow the opposition ruck down better than anyone else bar Exeter, so they're second best in the league. That gives them time to go and reset in their defensive line, go and chase and hunt that next tackle to get off the gain line to go and win that contact as well. They concede the fewest entries into their own 22, so they're rarely under pressure where it matters. Off of the back of that, they concede the fewest tries from their own 22, the fewest tries from set piece, and the fewest tries on the first phase. So their defensive structure just phenomenally well set up to be able to manage all the problems. That physicality in defense is something that never seems to go away. No matter when you look at this or what era of the game across the years, power is going to get you success. If that's power in attack, I think you could say this in the Champions Cup with the La Rochelles and the Leinsters, that power just wins you games. And they seem to manage that in defence, that their power stops all the momentum of the attack. Doesn't give them any ability to get any go forward, any momentum. They're not stressed, and therefore they concede the fewest tries and points. And one thing I looked at was sort of the individuals of those. I sort of touched on it briefly just then. I had a look at the top 10 most dominant tacklers in the league. 7 of them are from Sale. There's just frightening amount of players involved. Crazy. All 3 Dupree brothers, with Robert Dupree, actually the fly half 12, having more dominant tackles than his twin brothers. Both Currys are in there, and then John O'Ross as well, an absolute leader of a Sale team, is retiring at the end of the year. Just another phenomenal season. He's always at the top of those stats and those charts, made the most dominant tackles in the league.
And so when you look at Sale, they seem to me, they have that physicality, that edge in their pack that Alex Anderson's obviously wanted to recruit to build sort of this defensive, juggernaut as such of collision winners and tough set piece. And my question is, Saracens-esque in the way Saracens has built up the defensive side. How do Sale sit from an attacking standpoint, as we've just touched on Sarries and how they've developed this season? Sale obviously have George Ford in the mix there. What should we expect from them in attack as well?
Look, to be honest, George Ford, for one, has been injured for the majority of the season, so we haven't sort of seen his influence, unfortunately. But like you said, Sale, sort of perhaps the Saracens team evolved with Sanderson, very similar to a Leicester team with the Borthwick and the Wigglesworth influence. So they kick the second most in the competition behind Leicester. They then back their defence. And you could say that again of Saracens in the early days. That was solely their aim. Kick the ball away and then defend and then cause so much pressure in the right areas that they'll eventually find some gaps and some spaces to score, rather than creating too much themselves. And I think you might be able to say the same with Sale. Just respectfully, they're very much average, middle of the pack. in terms of their attack. They don't make line breaks. They don't want to play with the ball very much. They're the second fewest carries in the competition. So they're not after that. They're not trying to do that. They are trying to manipulate themselves into a good field position, put pressure on their opposition with their defence, and then take what they get. One thing for Sale is that they score the most tries from the opposition 22. They get there the second most. So that game plan of kicking the ball away and defending is the purpose of that is to get the ball back in the right areas. And they do that very well. And then they convert from that sort of set piece function, from that launch play of a line out. They score the most tries on the first phase. They've only scored the second most from mauls, though. So they scored 33 tries on the first phase. 11 of them are from mauls. So, yes, that is a lot, and that is one aspect that they're going to use and approach to score their tries. But that means 22 tries have been scored off of launch phases, launch plays. So it's not just those mauls. That's very strong, and they're going to use those really well. But they can play off of the back of them. Sometimes they are just peels as well off of the back of mauls. They count, but they use their strike runners. They've got a huge midfield with obviously Manu Tuolangi. If George Ford is in there, which he should be, then he can manipulate that and score really well. So they very, very structured, very formulaic, get into the right areas, use their set piece, use their structure, and then they score from that rather than anything sort of playing too much further out of the field.
Well, why don't we look now at their opponents in Leicester Tigers, a team that I feel like from the outside, waiting to hear from you by the numbers, will have a fair few similarities with some of what we've talked about with Sale.
Yeah, definitely. So most kicks in play now just above Sale, and kick for the most meters as well. So on average, they kick 35 times per game for about 1,100 meters. So you're thinking you're going 11 lengths of the rugby pitch just from your kick per game. That sort of tells you everything you really need to know about Leicester's style and how they approach the game. As I mentioned a little bit with Sale, the purpose of that, but actually what Leicester probably do even better, is to play then a very risk-averse style. The point is that you don't want to overplay in your own areas and give those opportunities to your opposition. That's what Sale's defence and what Saracens in the past, that's what they're trying to achieve. So by kicking the ball away, you don't give them that and you starve them of that opportunity. So Leicester concede the second fewest turnovers per game. They concede the fewest penalties in attack, just 2.5 penalties on their own ball per game. So they don't give any free, easy territory or possession to their opposition from making those errors. They have the highest positive outcomes of their possession. Nearly 80% of their possessions ends positively, meaning only 20% ends in an error, which is an incredible rate of return. They also then play with the second most territory of the competition. So it's 52%, and I know that doesn't feel like a big difference over 50%, considering they're the second best. But what that means is the amount of possession that is played in the opposition half, whether you've got the ball or not, and across the entire season, that 2% does make a difference. And you see a lot of teams that are in around 49.5s and 50s, that kind of thing. So very risk averse, not willing to make any mistakes. Again, similarly to Sale in this instance, is they want to get the ball back in the right areas. The thing for me for Leicester is this season, I don't think they've quite been as good as that. They won the title last year with this game style. I had a look at the final last year against Saracens, and they really doubled down their game style. So I mentioned, on average this season, they kick 35 times per game, and that's the most. In the final versus Saracens last year, they kicked 56 times. So over 20 times more. That was the most of any team in any game in the entire competition. But for me, the big difference is what they did with it, as I've been mentioning, when they get into those right areas. So they had the most entries into the red zone last year with over 10. They're down in 5th place now this season. They scored the second most tries from lineouts in 56. This year, they've scored just 33. They're in 9th position. Only 2 teams have scored fewer. Their tries from mauls, they were the 3rd best last year. They've only scored 5 maul tries in total across the whole season, Leicester have this year. So their element for me, where they need to perhaps look to improve, or where they'll really need to get right in order to win this game, is converting when they get there. Again, we said this, I've said this a few times now. The purpose is getting into the right areas. You just need to do something with it once you have that ball back, and Leicester haven't quite managed that. And they're going to have to do that against arguably the best defence in the competition. Sale in this instance as well, barring just points and tries conceded where they're the best. They've conceded the fewest tries from lineouts. They've conceded the fewest tries from their own 22. They've conceded the fewest tries on first phase and from those mauls. So they are incredibly well set up to manage where Leicester need to improve. So I think for me, just looking at the numbers from the data, it's a big ask for Leicester to overcome those differences at the moment.
So by the numbers, we're saying we've got a Saracens Sale final going on as such.
For me, yes. Obviously, that is just the numbers, and we love the emotion of the game and the day. As you say, there's rivalries everywhere. There's old relationships everywhere with players and coaches alike. So we never know. That's the beauty of the game of rugby. But for me, yes, I can't see much past the Sale and Saracens final.
Well, I think that's a good place to sort of wrap it up and end it. And we'll see after this weekend if the numbers add up to the reality. As, yeah, this is why we watch the sport. If it was just a purely numbers game, it wouldn't be as an exciting watch as it could be with the unknowns. And Ross, thank you so much for all your insights, for the data, for just the work you do as well, from our broadcast at NBC to a number of other broadcasts across different platforms. You add a lot of value, and we're really grateful.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that, Corbs. Cheers.
And that is a wrap on this week's show. Thank you, everyone, for listening or watching. We really appreciate all the support. Longer episode this week as well, so thanks for staying with us. But I felt there was a lot to talk about and stuff that needed covering. I hope you guys all enjoy that as well. Keep an eye out. We have a couple more weeks left of the pod to go. Exciting times with Premiership semi-final, then final. We really appreciate all your support, and thanks for being a loyal Scrum Down supporter. We'll see you again next week.